Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe. My name is Brian Whitmore. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and an associate professor of practice at the University of Texas at Arlington. I'm also the editor and coordinator of the Atlantic Council's ongoing paper series, Russia Tomorrow, Navigating a New Paradigm. This is a series that we launched almost 2 years ago under the direction of Ambassador John Herbst, the senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. This series seeks to illuminate various aspects of Russian politics and foreign affairs and explain what has changed or not changed since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Past papers have examined topics like the evolution of Putin's inner circle, the geopolitics of Russian energy, public opinion, demographics, and cyber capacity, just to name a few. Today, we are launching the 12th paper in our series, How Have Russia's Narratives Shaped Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, by Casey Michel, who is one of the most thoughtful and outside-the-box thinkers in the Russia-watching space. For those of you who don't know Casey's work, it focuses on kleptocracy, illicit finance, foreign lobbying, foreign interference, and the legacies of Russian and Soviet colonialism. He's the director of the Combating Kleptocracy program at the Human Rights Foundation and author of 3 books, American Kleptocracy, Foreign Agents, and the Forthcoming United States of Oligarchy. The paper we'll be discussing today examines the narratives Russia has used to justify and support its invasion of Ukraine. This is an important paper because in addition to being a war of choice, an illegal act of aggression, and a colonial war, Russia's war against Ukraine is also a war of narratives and a battle over history. So that's enough from me. Take it away, Casey.
Thanks so much, Brian, and thank you to everyone for being here today. Of course, thank you to the Atlantic Council. This is, by my count, the second paper I've put together for the Russia Tomorrow series. And in my unbiased opinion, this still remains the best series of analyses on Russia policy in Washington, not only for what it tells us about where Russia currently is, but more importantly for where it is going and what that means for countries like Ukraine. As Brian mentioned, the paper today looks in particular at the narratives that the Kremlin has put forth to defend and explain its ongoing invasion of Ukraine. More particularly, this paper is an effort to try to sort through the rhetorical muddle that Moscow has put forth in order to figure out what the core of the Kremlin's campaign is truly about, and how and why Western strategy must be adjusted to face these narratives head on. So, first things first, let's get to the narratives. As the paper argues, there are 6 primary narratives that the Kremlin has leaned on to defend and explain its war. The first 3 focus on Ukraine in particular, and especially Russia's relationship with Ukraine. The first narrative is that the Ukraine war is primarily about rescuing Russians and Russian speakers, especially in eastern and southern Ukraine. This is primarily predicated on the idea that Ukraine is overseen by fascists and Nazis who have been in power since the 2014 Euromaidan coup. I should pause and say a lot of these terms in these narratives come with their own quotation marks, so please don't take this as me saying there's any kind of coup in Ukraine in 2014. So that was the first narrative. The second narrative, Russia and Ukraine are actually brotherly nations, and Ukrainians are simply confused about their relationship as subalterns to Russia. This is primarily predicated on the idea that Ukraine is simply Little Russia, part of a triune states of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And this war is simply about restoring that Ukrainian status. It's also about restoring Russia's colonial control of Ukraine and keeping Ukraine as an entity subservient to Russia. The third narrative, Ukraine, does not even exist, but is simply a Leninist fabrication. This is predicated on the idea that Vladimir Lenin and other Soviet leadership were mistaken to draw any internal Republican borders within the Soviet Union, and that the entire near abroad is rightfully Russian. This war is simply about rectifying that Leninist mistake. So those are the first 3 narratives, placing Ukraine at the core of Russia's invasion. However, the other 3 narratives have significantly less to do with Ukraine in particular, and far more to do with Russia's global standing and the creation of a new geopolitical order. So those 3 are, number 4, this war is primarily about beating back NATO and Western expansion. NATO pledged in the early 1990s that it would not expand its borders, and this war is simply about forcing NATO to uphold that pledge. This war is therefore a defensive war aimed at preventing Russian encirclement. Number 5, this war is about the non-Western world, standing up to Western hypocrisy and decadence. Russia is at the vanguard of the non-Western world's fight against Western colonialism, trying to restore traditional values that the West is attempting to destroy around the world. And last but not least, number 6, this war is about restoring Russia's status as a great power, both in Europe and globally. It is primarily about ushering in a multipolar world with other civilization states such as China and India rising to parity with the United States. So those are the 6 narratives, and of course the paper goes into far more detail on all of them. As you can see, many of these narratives are overlapping and are not mutually exclusive. For instance, the notion that Russia and Ukraine are supposedly brotherly nations or even part of the same polity, that can be directly tied to the idea that Ukraine must be prevented from joining NATO. So too is the idea that Ukraine's democratic revolution in 2014 was actually a coup, which is a narrative that's often paired with the idea that this war is simply about rolling back Western influence. It's often difficult to tell where one narrative ends and the other begins, which is why we tried to write this paper in the first place. And sometimes these narratives are actually in direct contradiction to one another, such as when Putin claims that the war is supposedly anti-colonial, and yet certain countries are so-called civilization states that have the right to control surrounding nations, or elsewhere when Putin claims Russians and Ukrainians are supposedly brotherly nations, but that Ukraine itself is some kind of Leninist fabrication. Putin is many things, but we all know that historical accuracy is not his strong suit. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the paper does go into far more detail and has far deeper readings, so far more citations that I cannot recommend enough. I am sure that you're all here today familiar with these narratives. We've all been following this war for the last 4 years, and we've all heard these narratives in one form or fashion peddled by Putin and the Kremlin. But I do think that this paper and the fact that we are talking about this at the end of 2025 presents an opportunity to remind ourselves not only how this war began, but what the Kremlin's designs for the war both then and now actually are. Because despite all of the day-to-day developments, all of the so-called peace plans and negotiations that never seem to go anywhere, and despite the fact that the Kremlin has now somehow suffered as many casualties as the United States of America did during the entirety of the Second World War, Moscow's goals for the war have never wavered. They have not changed from what they were in February 2022. Or frankly, what those goals were in 2014, or even what those goals were in the lead up to the Orange Revolution some 20 years ago. Putin may claim that the war is about the supposed protection of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, or about the status of Ukraine in NATO. And some Americans, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, apparently still think that if we just swap a few parts of the Donbass, everything will go back to normal. But those beliefs and those claims all miss a far bigger picture, setting the stage for far worse to come. The war in Ukraine was never about the status of Zaporizhia or Kherson, or about the sovereignty over the Donbass, or even about whether or not Ukraine is in NATO. Ukraine is but a stepping stone for Putin's far more sweeping goals of rolling back U.S. and allied interests, reaffirming Russian dominance over most of its neighbors, and creating a world in which the rights of smaller nations are subject to the whims of a handful of great powers. It is about using Ukraine to restore Russia's supposed great power status, and about Putin's obsessions with his own historic legacy, an obsession that Ukrainians have made the ultimate sacrifice to fight. All of which adds up to the only strategic option still available. Putin will, until the day he dies, be convinced that he will ultimately be victorious in toppling Kyiv, either on the battlefield or through Ukrainian collapse. No amount of Russian deaths, no level of Russian economic calamity, and certainly no supposed peace plan will ever disabuse him of this idea. There is no off ramp to be found. Putin cannot be bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. That ship has sailed, which means that the only strategy for success moving forward is outright defeat of Putin's regime. Full stop. Anything less would be simply tempting the Kremlin to try again and to spin any narrative it needed to convince itself and the rest of us that it will be victorious. So, Brian, I'll stop there. Brian, you're still on mute, I believe.
Thank you, Casey, for that very, very tight presentation of what was an excellent paper. We're going to move to a panel discussion now, but I want to first remind our audience that they can ask questions at askac.org. We're going to go for about 30 minutes of moderated discussion, then we'll have 15 minutes of audience questions. And I want to introduce our panelists, and it is a great panel. We've got Julia Davis, who's the founder of the Russian Media Monitor, which is one of the most important resources that for us, those of us working in this space. Miriam Lanskoy, who's senior director for Russia and Eurasia at the National Endowment for Democracy, and Andrei Pertsev, who's a journalist whose work has appeared in Meduza, Riddle, and the Moscow Times, as well as elsewhere. And he's also a commentator for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Casey, I want to start with you. It seems to me that the narratives focused on Ukraine in your report, the three narratives focused on Ukraine, all derive in one form or another from one Russian meta-historical myth. And that is, of course, the appropriation and monopolization by Russia of the legacy of Kievan Rus, the medieval kingdom that was actually the antecedent for three modern nations: Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Even the name Rus, which is actually an Old Norse word for men who row, was appropriated by Ivan IV in the 16th century when he renamed the Grand Duchy of Muscovy the Tsardom of Rus. Can you talk briefly, because I know you and I have done some work together on this issue, can you talk briefly about how this meta-narrative, this appropriation and monopolization of the history of Rus informs the other narratives in your report about Ukraine?
Yeah, Brian, look, that's a great question. And of course, you've done fantastic work on this as well. You know, I think, you know, in my opening comments and certainly the paper itself, it talks a lot about what Putin has said, what Putin believes, what Putin has put forth. I think it's worth reminding the audience today that many of these narratives, many of these ideas, and many of these claims did not begin with Putin, and I have no doubt will not end with Putin. And as you just mentioned, Brian, at the core of many of these is this idea, this lie, this fabrication, whatever term you'd like to use, that there is this existing or supposed or maybe even ethereal triune state between Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, which goes back centuries and has at its core Russian dominance and fraternal relations with those other two countries. This is an argument that really came to the fore in the 19th century. Again, the paper goes into some of the details and some more citations on that, when young aristocrats around Moscow and certainly some emerging Russian scholars in the mid-19th century began putting forth this idea that there has always been, from time immemorial, a connection and fraternal relations between Ukraine and Russia, and there must be forevermore moving forward. It is Russia's birthright, and this is something that no outside actor, certainly not the West and certainly not the United States of America, can ever come between. And again, we see how this myth has manifested itself in Putin's commentary and his other allies in the Kremlin's commentary surrounding this, that this war is simply about restoring that historic relationship. Of course, that also means Russian dominance over so-called Little Russia, but about restoring what they see as a great catastrophe and certainly a mistake, that is to create any kind of distance between Russia and Ukraine whatsoever. Again, this is an idea that has deep, deep, deep roots and goes back centuries, and I suspect we will see for years to come.
Thank you, Casey. I want to move now to Julia. Julia, I like to say that you watch Russian state media so the rest of us don't have to. And you're, as I noted in the outset, your Russian media monitor is one of the most valuable assets for anybody working in this space. My question is, what narratives do you see evolving in Russian state and state-adjacent media at the moment? And how have they evolved in the nearly 4 years since the full-scale invasion? And are there any narratives you would add to Casey's list?
Yes, Casey's presentation was very exhaustive and brilliant. And what I would add is that there was a narrative that started more than 1 year before the full-scale invasion. And that narrative was, first of all, that it would be very easy to overtake Ukraine. That was one of the motivating factors. They believed it would be as easy as taking Crimea. Of course, the narrative about restoring the Russian Empire and that it could only be done through war. They've argued that Soviet Ukraine was created through war, and this is how they return it back into the fold, is through war. And not only that Ukraine doesn't really exist, but that for Russia's security, Ukraine should not be allowed to exist as an independent nation state. And throughout this war, as Russia experienced failures on the battlefield, the narrative has changed where at times they would say that at this point, their goal, as opposed to in the beginning talking about taking all of Ukraine, then they would talk about taking as much as they can possibly grab militarily. And now that they see Western alliances falling apart, they are back to arguing that all of Ukraine has to be taken. So it's a complete 360. They're back to the same narrative now that the Russian Empire has to be restored, Ukraine has to be absorbed in its entirety. And also another narrative that's emerging is that even if America accepts Russia's demands with respect to NATO, a bigger war is still looming on the horizon against NATO countries, because now they believe that NATO will not actually defend some of the smaller countries if Russia tries to attack them. So they're now working on that narrative as well. Also, I wanted to add that when Russia talks about denazification, their terms are completely different than what in the West people would think that it means something like the original definition of Nazism, whereas they have completely reworked it. In their definition, being a Nazi means being a Russophobe. Therefore, anyone who opposes Russia or tries to resist Russia's invasion is determined to be a Nazi. And when they say denazification, they repeatedly clarified in the Russian state media that means destruction, that means killing those people. And therefore, anyone who resists Russia is seen as a legitimate target for being killed. So those are important distinctions that when they say Nazi or denazification, they don't necessarily mean what we might think.
Thank you, Julia. I want to move to Miriam now. Miriam, I'd like to say that every Russian empire begins with Ukraine, but no Russian empire stops with Ukraine. And this kind of segues into your expertise. In addition to Russia, a lot of your work is focused on other former Soviet states in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. Do you see analogous Russian narratives to justify the dominance of other parts of the former Soviet Union or the Russian Empire? Or are the narratives we're seeing in Ukraine kind of unique and special to Ukraine?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you to you and the Atlantic Council for having this, and to Casey for this very important conversation about narratives. Of course, there's an underlying history, and the history is this, that the Romanov Empire was like any other European empire. It was built on conquest of different peoples. It fell apart, and there was a revolution. And here's the narrative that has hung around, which is somehow that the Soviet reconquest, whether of Ukraine or Central Asia or Caucasus, was somehow progressive, endowed these nations with nationhood. And in fact, because here, even on a deeper level, the Leninist definition of empire as capitalist. So, we're done with that. We're not an empire. And the ability to project the Soviet Union as anti-imperialist throughout the world, including the global South. So, of course, the Soviet Union was just the Russian Romanov Empire with a different ideological sauce that came apart in the early 1990s, liberating a lot of different nations. And this narrative is understood much more deeply today in Central Asia, for instance, than it was prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And there's a deep interest in studying language and history and looking at how this whole fiction that independence fell on us from above. People were struggling. People always wanted statehood and independence and sovereignty and so forth. I would say that there's real concern and real interest right now in looking at these things, and some very serious both archival histories and memory studies and documentation of these things. But I would say that this is also playing out right now in the Sahel, where Russia's project, totally classic imperialist extraction of gold from Car, Mali. They're pumping out. They're unable to deal with the jihadist insurgency. They have radicalized more people by repressing, savagery towards the civilian population. And yet the projection into Africa, a complete misunderstanding of what's going on in the Sahel, but the ability to project that Russia has evicted the old colonial powers and is now benefiting people. So this dichotomy between reality and that which is portrayed through not only state media, but various YouTubers, misguided academics, people irritated with the United States or Europe for other reasons who become easy prey. This is a very real problem, and these narratives are ever present. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Miriam, for broadening out the discussion here. I want to bring Andre into the discussion now. And Andre, I was reading your works, your recent works in preparation for this panel, and they happen to be very relevant. You had a couple of recent articles in Riddle that focused on the role of Alexander Hadichev, the head of the Kremlin's social monitoring unit, whom you dub the Kremlin's chief ideologue. And you note that previous figures in this role, people like Vladislav Surkov or Vyacheslav Volodin, focused on creating complex and obscure political constructs like sovereign democracy. Hadichev, on the other hand, is focused on a broader ideological framework, Russian civilization. What does this ideological turn we see in the Kremlin from Surkov's very kind of practical focus on sovereign democracy, as well as Volodin, to Hadichev's kind of movement to this broader civilizational ideology? What does this mean, and how does it relate to the narratives Casey presented in this paper?
We can argue that Putin himself has gradually become ideologized. He draws on a familiar set of academic, or more accurately, pseudo-academic sources. For example, he spontaneously invokes elements of Lev Gumilev theory of passionarity and devotes increasing attention to historical studies. The political apparatus then attempts to systematize these views into something about framework, or more precisely into a mosaic, since figures such as Gumilev and Eurasianist sit uneasily alongside a nationalist thinker like Ivan Ilyin. And within Gumilev civilization framework, Russian civilization is understood as encompassing many peoples, including Ukrainians. Civilizational theory appeals to Putin insofar as it portrays Russia, in contrast to the West, as a young civilization. Within the logic, the West is depicted as being in decline and therefore destined to lose. And Putin clearly demands sacrifice from population. For instance, he has stated that dying in war is preferable to dying from alcoholism. And figures such as Kharichev write about sacrifice and collectivism, despite the fact that sociological surveys do not support this claim. The same can be said of the rhetoric surrounding family values. Moreover, civilization theory dovetails with concept of a multipolar world that Putin actively promotes. In simplified terms, the claim is that there are no universal values or rules. Each civilization has its own. In practice, this amounts to arbitrariness, and yet, as often happens, elder individuals themselves begin to believe in increasingly particular and founded constructions.
Thank you. I want to stick with you, Andrei, as I go through the next round of questions. We came to you, and then we're going to go back in the opposite direction. You wrote a piece for the Carnegie Endowment back in September, explaining why Russia is insisting on elections in Ukraine before Putin will meet with Zelensky, which to us is laughable on the surface. He's saying Zelensky doesn't have legitimacy when, therefore Putin doesn't. But in addition to believing that this would lead to political instability in Ukraine, you also argue that the Kremlin often projects its own political culture and political practices onto other nations. According to this logic, you write that the Putin regime believes that if Zelensky were replaced, Ukraine might even seize military resistance. Now, that is anybody that knows anything about Ukraine or has spent any time with Ukrainians knows that that assumption is dubious, to put it politely. Do you see this as an example of Russia becoming a victim of its own myths and its own narratives here? Because they seem to be projecting something onto Ukraine that is not going to happen, but yet they seem to believe it. So is Russia high on its own supply, to put it, academically?
Judging by his action, Putin genuinely appears to hold the view that whatever force is in power in a given country is entitled to determine that country policies without regard for public opinion. This is precisely why because the Kremlin engage in influence operations which, in the view of Putin and his inner circle, can bring to power parties or individual politicians more loyal to Russia. Indeed, one of the core grievances directed at Ukraine and its population is the removal of Yanukovych, who was loyal to Putin. We can observe how Russia has attempted to orchestrate influence operation in Moldova in this year in order to install forces more favorable to Moscow. In Georgia, these calculations have largely been borne out, but this should be seen as exception rather than the rule. Because in Moldova, this operation was unsuccessful.
Thank you, Andre. And I want to move back to Miriam now. Miriam, it's often said that Russian liberalism stops at the Ukrainian border. You've done a lot of work on Russia's beleaguered civil society. How much of a priority, if at all, is countering these false narratives about Ukraine for Russian civil society, for Russian liberals in general?
I think that, of course, this is a top priority. The media that Andre works for, Medusa, has a daily tracker where the first thing that you see every day is how many thousands of days of war, which day we're on, and what's happening that day. And Russian media in particular has been countering, not just countering, but telling the truth, right? It's been providing information analysis every single day and doing very, very important investigations as well. But let me go back to this question of, and not only media, there are lawyers who are defending, and there's all kinds of good work being done by Russian civil society that projects a different, completely different kind of Russia. But let me go back to narratives. You have at the Atlantic Council a fellow, Mikhail Zygar, who is also probably Russia's most important public intellectual. And he is doing the work that I was, outlining this history, telling the history, and he calls it a people's history of Russia. Not a state focus, not the development of our wonderful state structures, right. There are people like him. He is a best-selling author. His videos get millions of views. There's demand for this. And where we and you and others need to come in is to elevate it, to tell the story of the conquest. He has historical analysis as well as that explains the contemporary situation. So I do think that there's very important work being done, and we can all do more to elevate it. Thank you.
Yeah, Mikhail Zygar has already written 2 papers in this series, and he's going to I'm very happy to say he'll be writing one in the coming year. Moving on to Julia, I was looking at your Russian Media Monitor YouTube channel, also in preparation for this event. And in recent weeks, you've had Vladimir Solovyov predicting that America and Russia will jointly attack Russia. America and Europe will jointly attack Russia. You also had him calling for the assassination of European leaders. This suggests a desire by the Kremlin to project an atmosphere of threat to the Russian people. But on the other hand, in a recent article for the Daily Beast, you noted a very triumphant air among Kremlin-adjacent Russian commentators regarding things like the 28-point peace plan and the recently released U.S. national security strategy. How do you square this apparent contradiction between this creating this atmosphere of threat on one hand and this atmosphere of triumphalism on the other? And how does this relate to the narratives about Ukraine?
Well, it's directly related to narratives about Ukraine, and actually they are demonstrating Putin's own views, apparently. He recently described the European countries as suckling piglets, implying the United States as the mother pig on whom they are entirely dependent. And our new national security strategy left the Russians convinced that Europe is losing the protection of the United States as the main NATO member, and they think that they can threaten Europe into backing away from Ukraine, which is what they're actively doing, and that explains their threats against the European leaders. This explains their claim that the United States will join Russia and attack European cities. That is their main objective, because they think Europe does not have enough weapons, money, or persistence to continue to support Ukraine in the long term. So they're actively working to undermine that. So that is absolutely related to Ukraine, and this is their deterrent strategy. And as far as the peace plan goes, they have absolutely no interest in it. They already got what they wanted when there were promises already made that Ukraine will not be accepted into NATO. That's the main thing they wanted, because that leaves Ukraine helpless against continued aggression. And they believe that the United States no longer sees protecting Ukraine as part of its national security interests. And by entering into business deals with America, they can distract it and cement its own part as some sort of a partner with the United States, where Ukraine will be left standing alone and Europe will be too scared to and too depleted to continue doing it on its own.
Yeah, it's very interesting how Europe has replaced the United States as the main enemy in Russian media narratives now, as Europe becomes more forceful in defending Ukraine, and the United States becomes less forceful. Thank you, Julia. I want to kind of bring the panel discussion full circle by coming back to Casey, who's the reason we're having this discussion. Casey, the subtext of the narrative analyzed in this report is a colonial logic. This is something several of the panelists have discussed, a colonial logic on the part of Russia, even as one of the narratives presents Russia as an anti-colonial power. Can you elaborate on both how the colonial logic undergirds all these narratives and this contradiction that there is a colonial logic undergirding all the narratives while one of the narratives actually presents Russia as an anti-colonial power?
Well, that's a great question, Brian. Look, the undergirding element of this is that Russia is by right, simply by being the fact of what it is, destined to dominate many, if not all, of its neighboring nations. Perhaps not North Korea and China, perhaps not even Mongolia, but certainly those former Soviet states and plenty, if not all, of the former Russian and Soviet colonies themselves. This is the kind of firmament upon which Russia builds all of these narratives. Russia is a supposed great power, a supposed civilization state. Andre, I wasn't expecting to talk about Lev Gumilyov today. It's been a little bit since I've done any writing on Gumilyov, but you can look to that kind of writing that this is almost a holy a description of what Russia is and will remain perhaps forevermore. This is its right. And of course, this is potentially a narrative we've seen elsewhere. This is something that parallels narratives out of other colonial empires. I'm so happy Miriam brought up this idea, this resurfacing, this rediscovery of these colonial legacies in places like Central Asia and the Caucasus. But I should say as well, in the United States of America, there has been a significant shift over the last few years, largely because of Ukraine's ongoing fight against Russia and the Russian Federation, that Russia deserves to be part of the broader story, the broader narrative, if you will, of European imperialism writ large. For years, for decades, potentially even for centuries, the idea that Moscow, whether the Tsarist iteration or the Soviet iteration, was part of the broader story of European imperialism, that was never quite there for a number of different reasons, not only because of the Soviet incarnation, but also because Russia did not tend to have overseas territories, at least excepting Alaska. And only within the last few years have we seen this emergence of discourse, especially in the United States of America, to reintroduce Russia to the broader story, the broader sweep of European imperialism, and look for what other parallels and what other policy shifts may emerge. Look, this is a far broader conversation, Brian, maybe for something in the future, but you look at Britain's relationship with Ireland, you look at Portugal's relationship, and certainly its wars in southern Africa in the 1970s, and you look maybe most especially at France's his war and relationship with Algeria, and this idea in Paris that Algeria was simply another part of France proper, wasn't even necessarily a colony. You see all of these ingredients building up into what Russia has put forth in Ukraine and certainly elsewhere as well in terms of other former and even current colonies in the Russian Federation. And I think it's going to go a significant way to helping all of us understand the best path forward and, of course, what is at the core of this war in Ukraine in the first place.
Terrific. Thank you, Casey. And now we're going to move to audience questions. Now we got about 15 minutes. I'm going to abuse my privilege as the moderator to choose which ones. And I'm going to start with one from Maria Tkachenko. And she asks, and this is a great question, do you think Vladimir Putin believes in any one of these narratives more than the other? Which of these narratives are used tactically to justify the war to a Western and domestic Russian audience? And which does Putin and the Russian elite really believe in? I want to, anybody, Casey, certainly I want you to respond to that, but I also want to get thoughts from the other panelists on that.
Well, I'll just jump in briefly. I think some of them certainly are used a little bit more tactically than others. The idea that Russia is leading a campaign of denazification, that's something we have seen kind of ebb and flow through the years, depending on the audience and certainly depending on where the status of the war in Ukraine actually is. But I think it's looking at the ones that have been consistently there, not just during the war, but going back decades, if not centuries themselves. The idea that Russia and Ukraine are brotherly nations, the idea that Russia has a right to dominate Ukraine, they're part of the same polity. Maybe there isn't even any difference whatsoever. I do think at its core, that is something that Putin and his allies believe, and I have no doubt that that is something they will continue to believe for the future.
Yeah, thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to jump in? Because I'd like to hear what all you have to say about this. Julia?
Yes, I think that Putin believes that Russia deserves to be a major global power, that it has been robbed of this right by the West, that it deserves to be a bigger, more powerful empire as it once was, and he tries to base it on historic events going far back. And you could see that even by his interactions with Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff. What he repeatedly brings up are those historic references. So I think he actually has himself convinced that Russia deserves to be a major empire once again, and that the West has to yield to it because it deprived it of this divine right in the past.
Thank you, Julia. Miriam or Andre, any thoughts on this? Which narratives are tactical and which ones do they really believe?
So I used to think, thanks for the question. It's a very good question.
Very good question.
I used to think that all the ideology was instrumental, that really these guys are just trying to hold on to power, get as much money as they can. It's about billions of dollars swirled away someplace. I am getting away from that now, and I do think something happened to Putin during COVID, where he was very isolated and apparently with these ideologists and looking at maps from God knows when, and really persuaded himself of some of these things, that it was the isolation of COVID that did make him more. But this is conjecture, obviously. Yeah. But he does what one of the themes that's consistent is the world should be run by several great powers. It's kind of like the 19th century concert of Europe, except it's global. And Russia is one of those powers, and that's very important for domestic legitimation and for Putin's image of himself and of Russia.
Yeah, no, I've often said Putin wants to party like it's 1799. I, like you, Miriam, see this ideological turn. I see it in stages. I thought it began 2013, 2014, after Putin returned to the Kremlin the second time. And then I thought, of course, accelerated after COVID. Andre, any thoughts on this? Which narratives are tactical and which ones are truly believed?
Putin believe that Russia it's one of the poles in a multipolar world. I think one is the center of power, and he dreamed about big empire. He read something pseudo. Pseudo-academic studies like the Chimik Mendeleev. He thought that in Russia will live 5,000. 500,000 of people in 20th century, and Putin told that it's true. I believe in it, and it's Russia will be half minimum population.
Thank you. Did you? Okay, continue.
No,
thank you.
that's all.
Okay, thank you.
But Mendeleev is a chemist, and he's not have degree in demography or sociology. It's fairy tale.
Right. Thank you. A related question from Michael Abbott. And the question is, to what extent does Russia's invasion of Ukraine reflect ambitions of imperial restoration on one hand versus Putin's personal ambition to use the war as a means of staying in power? This is another question. It's a great question, but it also asks us to get inside of Putin's head. And I always say it's very dark inside of Putin's head, and it's hard to see anything. But we'll try. Who wants to tackle that one? Maybe we start with Casey.
Sure, I'm happy. Yes, Brian, please be sure to bring a flashlight if you're ever inside of Putin's head. Otherwise, you won't be able to see anything. You know, I think it's very clear that Putin has these historic obsessions. It's very clear that he sees himself, and then, you know, there's that kind of now infamous quote that he only sees himself alongside Catherine the Great and a few other Russian emperors of the past as this man of what is it? A great man of history, and it is his legacy that he would leave behind as the gatherer of Russian lands and the restorer of Russia's status as a great power globally. But that is completely entwined with his continuing role as the leader of the Russian Federation and his role in the Kremlin itself. You cannot disentangle the two, or at least it's incredibly difficult to disentangle the two. And that is before even discussing the difficulties that we will see moving forward, if we ever get there, of moving Putin's regime from a wartime footing to a more peacetime economy. That is going to be something that will take significant effort domestically in Russia, again, if we ever get to that point. So I see them as two sides of the same coin. Of course, Putin has no notion that he will ever leave power until the day he dies. And whatever distance may have existed between the two of them, I don't see a lot of daylight between them anymore.
Thank you, Casey. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that one? If this imperial ambition versus Putin's desire to use the war to stay in power, I don't think these two are mutually exclusive. I think it's both. Go ahead. Yeah.
Let me just come in a little bit on that. I think that when you looked at Crimea, so if you go back to 2014 and to getting to that period, that was much more about staying in power. And there was, without getting too, there was a powerful democratic movement in Russia that was challenging Putin. And using, seizing Crimea, using imperialism at that point, I do think was a strategy to remain in power. After the first 2-3 weeks of the invasion, it no longer made sense in terms of staying in power in 2022. That looks somewhat delusional. You had Yanukovych and his people. It was a little bit like I'm going to forget his name, the Iraqi gentleman who came to Chalabi. It was like a little bit like Chalabi and us taking Chalabi too seriously before the Iraqi invasion. It looked a little bit like Putin isolated during COVID, having weird ideas in his head. Yanukovych and very specific security services come in with a story about how Ukraine will fold in a few days. By the way, that's what got them into the Chechen wars as well. That was gonna last 2 days. And then he's in and not getting out, and he's caught in there. He can't win, and he can't get out. Or I mean, I think he could, but somehow it hasn't figured out that it's actually better for him. I think there's a piece by Rodchenko out today that U.S. can support Ukraine indefinitely, and it's really in Putin's interest to start winding things up because it's undermining his government and the destroying Russia. So let me stop there. I think this one is a disaster for him.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Miriam. Another great question here from Jack Krupansky. Can we expect any evolution in Russia's narratives going forward, or have they stabilized and are likely to simply be repeated endlessly with little change or no more than de minimis evolution going forward? That's an interesting question. Do we expect these to evolve, or are these narratives pretty much static? I'd like to start with Casey, and then I'll bring in some other panelists.
Yeah, that's a great question. My sense is that they are relatively static insofar as we have seen many of these narratives remain effectively what they are from February 2022 till what they are now, and absent any kind of exogenous shocks. I suppose Donald Trump's reelection may be the biggest thing that shifted some of these narratives. We've already discussed earlier how it is now the Europeans that are the primary enemy rather than the United States of America in Moscow's eyes. But I don't suspect these narratives to shift that much moving forward so long as Putin remains in power. Of course, the big question on my end is if and when the Russian war effort is defeated, or we see some kind of post-Putin presidency. That's really when I'll begin looking for what these narratives are shifting into. But of course, that may be a ways away. So no, for the time being, I suspect we will see these being relatively static.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with that. Julia, I'd like to hear from you on this, because you among us, you pay attention on a daily basis to the narratives oozing out of Russian state and state adjacent media.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, I believe that they are going to stick with their current narrative for quite a while. It could only change depending on how things are going militarily for them, because typically when the more they're failing, the more modest their demands become. But as long as they're continuing inching forward, these narratives are here to stay for the foreseeable future. Another factor is their economy, which is not doing well. That may impact it at some point. And they're talking about involving more foreign troops in their endeavor because they don't want to conduct a full-fledged mobilization. So those narratives may slightly change based on that, but it's likely to stay this way. And also, I wanted to quickly add something about the previous question. Putin never saw himself losing power, but he sees the Ukrainian war as a way to cement himself on a larger scale. And when this invasion started, State Duma members even referred to him as Putin the Great. And they started to slip in narratives in different state media programs about how Russia always needs a czar, or Russia always needs an emperor in order to thrive. So they are, of course, intertwined, but Putin is planning to cement himself on a larger scale as someone who led Russia to become an empire once again. And so this narrative along with their narrative that they have to retake Ukraine and reestablish control over the former Soviet republics, is here to stay for quite some time, barring unforeseen circumstances.
Yeah, no, thank you, Julie. I'm glad you brought in this issue of Putin's view of his place in history, because I think he is positively obsessed with that. I recall an article by Vladislav Surkov back in 2019 in Nezavismaya Gazeta, which said Putin is the fourth great manifestation of the Russian state after Ivan III, Peter the Great, and Vladimir Lenin, of course. We got time for one more question, and I'm just going to throw it to every panelist, and then we'll end with concluding remarks, because we got about 5 minutes to go. This one comes from John Goodman, and it goes to the issue of whether the Kremlin's high on its own supply. He said, why did Putin miscalculate so badly in his invasion of Ukraine by believing that Ukrainians and Ukraine's government wouldn't resist? I think this is relevant to all the narratives, and again, to my think that they're believing their own hype, which has detrimental effects. Casey, you want to jump on that?
Yeah, just briefly, of course, this goes back to this myth that Ukrainians and Russians are truly brotherly nations. They're part of one kind of historic or even metaphysical polity themselves, and whatever kind of disunity is a complete fabrication. So, of course, they would welcome their Russian brothers with open arms. That's part of the reality. The other part, of course, is that just as we have seen in kind of autocratic models elsewhere, the longer a leader tends to stay in power, the more they are simply surrounded by yes men and sycophants who tell the leader what they want to hear. Certainly, we've seen plenty of great reporting to indicate that that was the case, especially among Russia's intelligence services, who were just feeding Putin what he wanted to hear about what was happening on the ground. Of course, we've already mentioned Viktor Yanukovych, Viktor Medvedchuk, a handful of others, all simply telling Putin that he was destined to be victorious and the Ukrainians would roll over and welcome them. And we've seen the result. Absolute disaster for the Russians.
Super. Thank you, Casey. Last words to you, Julia. I'm just going down my list.
Well, I think also the ease with which they were able to annex Crimea, the inadequate sanctions that followed, that played a big part in them thinking that taking Ukraine as a whole would be fast and easy. I have an entire playlist on the Russian Media Monitor YouTube channel dedicated to their predictions about how easy it was, where it goes all the way from saying it will be instant. The moment the Russian troops enter the Ukrainian territory, that will be the end of this war, and Ukrainians will immediately surrender, with some predicting it would take 8 minutes, 2 days, 3 days, 10 days. So, but a lot of it had to do with the way Crimea went, which they also repeatedly referred to. The reaction from the West prompted them to think it would be easy. Ukrainians not resisting at that point made them think that it would be easy. Well, I mean, the resistance was not on the level that would deter them, which again reiterates that weakness invites further aggression, and that played a major part in them thinking that taking Ukraine would be easy, and they predicted Ukrainians would come out with sweetbread and flowers to welcome them in as liberators. So they were high on their own supply, and it certainly backfired. And you could see what sore spot this is for them when they repeatedly deny that they predicted a quick victory of Ukraine, which of course they did.
Yeah, that playlist on the Russian Media Monitor YouTube channel is great. I recommend anybody looking at it. And along these lines about how arrogant they were, I read even that the Russian soldiers in the initial invasion ports packed dress uniforms. Nobody packs dress uniforms when they go into combat, and it had already minted the medals for the quote-unquote liberation of Kyiv. Thank you, Julia. Miriam.
Is there something just in general about narratives or just closing thoughts?
I mean, you can mix them together, but like, why did Putin miscalculate so badly? Like, why did he believe his own hype? Why was he high on his own supply? It's a good question, but you can also
I think the West has been so again, I think he pushes to see what he can get away with. The West has been so mealy-mouthed and weak and inconsistent, and he can always try to outmaneuver. And it's a luxury to not take our foreign relations very seriously. Other places are enormously focused on this and put a lot of resources into it. And he thinks he can play a lot of different games. What he's getting now, the division that I didn't realize that he's talking about how U.S. and Russia can attack Europe, driving a wedge. This is, by the way, long-standing Soviet goal: drive a wedge between U.S. and Europe. He has a lot of confidence in his ability to play endless games like this, and usually get away with it. And when I say that this is destroying Russia, it's destroying Russia very slowly, but it is. Especially if we get serious about things like the shadow fleet, sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft that just came in. If those things are in place, and if we continue to support Ukraine, he can't quite play those games, but he thinks he can. He thinks he will always, outplay and outmaneuver. That there's such we might be very smart and very wealthy, but we're so poorly coordinated and so unfocused that he can outmaneuver. I think that's the.
Thank you, Miriam. And the last word goes to Andrei.
Thank you. I think that Putin is driving crazy, and I don't know what he will do. But I know that Russian economics just now has many problems, and I think that Kremlin have no money to spend on infrastructure or salary for doctors, teachers, and will and have the war. I think it's impossible. And Russia is northern country, and infrastructural questions for Russia, it's very important. It's not Iran, it's not African state, it's not Venezuela, etc. And I think it's will be a great problem next year for Putin.
Right, Phil, that's a good place to wrap it up. We've reached the end of our time. I want to thank Casey for an excellent paper and for an excellent presentation. Thank our panelists, Julia Davis, founder of the Russian Media Monitor, Miriam Lanskoy, Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia at the National Endowment for Democracy, and Andrei Pertsev, a journalist for Meduza, whose work has also appeared in Riddle in the Moscow Times, and a commentator for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Anybody that hasn't had enough, this discussion will continue on the Power Vertical podcast, where Casey will be my guest to talk about this very topic, which we'll record later this afternoon, and it will drop this evening. So keep an eye out for that. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and that wraps it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Hope that went all right, Olivia.
Yes, no, it went great. Yes, thank you. Definitely great. Interesting to kind of hear about this stuff from everyone. So, but yeah, feel free to log off